Um, Sorry, I usually do not do autobiography, but I think in this case it's relevant. I don't think I would have developed an obsession with Asia, or actually an identification with Asia, if my father hadn't taken me as a child to Indonesia, which has recently become independent in '52, and I spent 4 years there. In a country which at that point was not particularly sympathetic to our nation, to the point that I also had to go underground in a certain way, went to Indonesian schools, spoke Indonesia, and had the privilege of living like an Asian for 4 years. And I think that actually really explains a lot of my current preoccupations. My father was director of a foundation which was called Stichting voor Culturele Samenwerking, Cultural Foundation. And in that sense, I feel a little bit alienated with a kind of relentless emphasis on trade in terms of Asian communication, because trade is certainly important, but I think that our current government is really to some extent exaggerating, and this is a typical newspaper heading. This is a speech that Prime Minister Rutte gave in Russia, and every yellow word is business. And I know that essentially even the Russians were offended by the proliferation and the actual slight vulgarity of this insistence. I think there is a kind of very crucial moment in Dutch culture where I think only a very limited amount of our former virtues and our former qualities is still operating. We were a country of tolerance, we were a country of wide horizons, but it seems as if we are kind of determined now to shed some of those previous conditions. And of course that makes operating in the cultural sector quite difficult. Even design is seen as a tool for trade, but if you actually look at the quality of the design, and if you look at the quality of architecture, it seems again as if Holland is trying to become a brand, and therefore is accepting a kind of caricature of both its history and its future, and that frankly makes me deeply uncomfortable. Here is our Prime Minister on television speaking to youth. It was for 1 hour, and the word Europe did not fall a single time. That is actually quite bizarre at this kind of particular moment. And I had the privilege to be in the same TV program with the same speaker, and therefore it is ironically shifting to people like me who are architects to talk about issues like Europe, and to try to represent in this moment of bizarre neglect, given the urgency, the case of Europe. So therefore you have to bear with me. I see myself as an architect who is forced by circumstances to also be active in other domains. This morning there was a meeting of ambassadors. This is a kind of world map of a kind of shrinking, deliberately shrinking influence, closing embassy and kind of reduced support. And although this is a kind of recent photograph, which apparently took a very brief moment of togetherness, the reality is that I think the true spirit of Holland now is to expand the hypocrisy of what we call a flex black, which is the well-respected kind of so-called flexibility of working spaces, which actually is very often a kind of a new form of harshness to the collaborator. It now seems as if ambassadors too will be working from Flexplekken in a seriously kind of reduced platform and on seriously limited issues, of which, of course, trade is the dominant one. Now, it's maybe not a coincidence that both in terms of metaphor, the word architect and the word ambassador are used interchangeably. And it is true that we work in many of the same ways, because these are currently the areas in which our office is active, and I'm not showing that as a kind of triumphalist image, but what it means if you project the different cultural, economic, and political conditions on this situation, you realize that in order to work in such a network, you need to have a kind of deep knowledge and also thorough appreciation of these differences and their implications on your work. And so therefore, whether we want to or not, we have a kind of huge investment in the generation of knowledge, the generation of information also, and the generation of exchange. And we are forced, exaggerated and arrogant as it sounds, to have our own world vision. And so therefore, I want to explain in which world vision I consider that we are operating. Personally, I think that Europe had a kind of superb opportunity in the year 2001 when America was hit by Al-Qaeda and simply used that moment to go on an incredibly solitary journey both inside and outside America. I think that was a moment that Europe should have kind of realized that it is part of the Eurasian landmass, and that exactly because it is now becoming a cliche that China is going to be kind of very important, very big, very rich, etc., to reconsider an almost Greek representation of the world, where Europe and Asia are deeply connected, and where also Africa is part of a single entity. This is for me the kind of world that I'm interested in kind of working in, and what that implies is that there are a number of different entities, Europe, Russia, India, China, and the Arab world, that need to find kind of ways to interact that are more productive and less exploitative than they are now. We all know the animosities, the hostilities, and the mutual lack of confidence and faith. But I believe that it is a kind of very serious effort, and I see us as architects kind of participating in this effort to redefine human rights, corruption, freedom of speech, free trade, proliferation and copyright. And what I think is particularly important, as we in the West are more ingenious and I think less dogmatic in terms of defining these, and less aggressive and opportunistic in using them against cultures that are different from our own. Because I think that has been one of the kind of very serious mistakes, that even the word copyright and if you see the real actions of copyright in terms of denying people information, it is really a very serious, it is not really in itself a kind of beautiful series of issues. So we consider ourselves involved in a constant communication between these different entities. And communication, and that is of course the key thing, is always a two-way process. And this is, for instance, currently deeply lacking, I feel, in the communication between Holland and China. We hope to sell, but there are very few people in Europe that actually hope to learn something from China, or that can even imagine learning from China. And the same is true in terms of kind of learning from the Arab world, for instance. We always still consider ourselves in possession of the real knowledge, in possession of the real sophistication, and are very reluctant to, by the idea to do something back, to receive something back. Apart from architecture, you also, therefore, and I would almost say, again, by default, writers, because what we try to do is to understand everything, every environment, every context where we are active, to understand it first before we operate there. And therefore, I want to kind of briefly show some of those efforts and how they are currently focused on Asia. I just published a book, Project Japan, which was for me a very interesting effort, particularly in the context of learning, because Japan in 1960 launched an architectural movement, the Metabolists, and that was the first time the world was confronted with an architectural avant-garde that was not Western, not European, not white. And therefore it was a kind of really a radical moment, because suddenly you could be modern, but you didn't need to be Western. And what we're trying to show in this book is how that phenomenon had a huge impact not only in Japan, but also in Singapore, also in the Arab world, and also in Africa. Because in the 60s, of course, Africa became independent, and it had very little appetite to celebrate this independence with European or American architects. And so what I've tried to kind of clarify and illustrate in this book is two things: how there is a kind of modernity over which we don't have any influence, and that it can be kind of very sophisticated modernity, and that another aspect of it was kind of only slowly became clear to myself, namely that it was a modernity that was involved and deeply triggered, you could say, by the state. We live in a kind of situation, although our country is totally dependent on regulation, given the intricacy of its infrastructure. We live in a political period where strong government in the Western world is met with incredible skepticism. What in the 60s in Japan underpinned in a way the economic miracle is very strong connections between the political world, the business world, and the artistic world. And so for that reason, this was a kind of very important book for me to write, simply in order to try to put those connections on the agenda again, and not to be kind of simply be part of a trade mission to sell more. In the same way, we recently kind of produced a book on the Arab world, in which we actually announced that the Arab world was undergoing incredible changes just before the Arab world exploded. And simply kind of introducing in the kind of Western world images like this one, which is downtown Riyadh. And what you see is kind of Egyptian families that as families kind of picnic in public space, is so to such an enormous extent belying our current perception of worlds that are completely separate, kind of families that live in kind of medieval circumstances of separation, etc., etc. So our aim here is to simply show the absurdity of how typical images like this one have a degree of unfamiliarity for us, and I think that actually your work in China is trying to do in many ways the same thing, to show how prejudiced in fact we are. This is another moment, a new kind of train line opened in Saudi Arabia, where kind of women travel in the same compartments as men, kind of simply showing that there again things are not as vigorous or relentless as we imagine. Like Peter, I've also written about China. I wrote a book in '94 about urbanization in the Pearl River Delta. And what I kind of wanted to do there is, and kind of show there, is that there is a kind of strange phenomenon. This is the curve of our urbanization. Basically, when we were urbanizing, we had a lot of architectural manifestos and produced a lot of architectural ideas. But when we were more or less finished, as we are now, our production of ideas stopped. At the exact moment that China started to urbanize at a kind of pace that we never knew. And so therefore, the irony is that although we look at this kind of phenomenon of Chinese urbanization, we are not participating in it in any real way. So and this is, I think, very important. Communication is not a one way. You also need to learn and be interested in the other system and the other values. And so one of the things we discovered that, for instance, in the new city of Shenzhen, a city that in 20 years went from 600,000 or even less to 12 million and now 50 million, you have in the center of a metropolis, less than 400 meters away from operating rice fields. So where we believe in kind of homogeneity and kind of organization, what the speed of urbanization alone is generating in China is proximities that have never existed in Western culture. And by looking at this book, at these phenomena, we were able, as foreigners, to participate in kind of Chinese thinking about itself. And one of the concepts that we introduced is that this is the Pearl River Delta, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Zhuhai, and Macau. Currently something like 36 million people altogether, but already in 20 years probably 70 million people. That this is going to be a single kind of organism of cities, a single cluster of cities, but that doesn't mean it will be homogeneous. And we called it kind of city of exacerbated difference. We believe that this urban system will continue to work by opposition, so that each part will define itself in contrast to all the other parts, and so that the slightest adjustment in one part has got repercussions in the other part. So it's an entirely different future of cities than the one we are used to. We are used to harmonious, more or less coherent models. This will be a kind of system of cities that will constantly undergo adjustment, opportunistic changes, and therefore never show a kind of harmony. It's well known that we did CCTV. It's maybe less well known that we did CCTV deliberately. We were invited to do the competition for the reconstruction of World Trade Center at the same time. We chose for the Chinese thing. Here the building is. What very few people realize is that architecture is at this point such a kind of incredibly international profession that actually itself represents a kind of United Nations. In our office, this is the nationalities that worked on the project. So CCTV is a kind of project which is already from its very conception half Chinese and considerable Japanese participation and for the rest European. So in that sense, in these international organizations, there are already collaborations going on that have a kind of futuristic element. And that are less about trade and commercial kind of interest, but more about cultural exchange. Why did we do it, and what did we think we had to add? One thing that we added was a kind of public loop, and that is still in the kind of finished building. And what it will enable is the Chinese population to enter every component of the building from the studio production to the broadcasting to the management and to the script writing, and simply have an entrance to media. And I'm not saying that with that entrance, kind of Chinese media will be like Western media in the near future, but on the other hand, it is a form of transparency and access that I think is relevant. The other thing, and maybe this is not visible on the immediate radar, the other thing that a building like this one represents is not an exchange of artistic culture or an exchange of taste, but it's also an exchange of technical know-how and technical procedure. Because CCTV, as you can probably guess, is not an easy structure to design, and it's not an easy structure to calculate. And therefore it's a structure that actually could have been imagined maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but it could only have been calculated in the last 8 years because of the kind of computers we have in the West. Those computers were not there in China at the time. So what we introduced is kind of ways of calculating, and we introduced those kind of ways of calculating to the elite of Chinese engineering. The kind of assembled engineering professors of China were in a kind of test group that kind of initially received us with incredible skepticism, that we had to meet at least 7 times, every time kind of knowing more and answering in more detail their questions, so that we kind of finally overcame their skepticism. And for me that was a kind of really important cultural exchange, because it meant that Marxist professors who thought that load needed to go straightforwardly to the ground, according to a kind of scientific principles, were confronted with an alternative way of doing it, which was perhaps more experimental and certainly more creative. And in that way we also felt that apart from the building itself, we opened in China possibilities and creativities that are now accessible for the Chinese themselves. We had to go so far in the calculation of the building that we even found out that the coupling between the two halves could only take place at a given moment in time, namely 6:12 in the morning, because the different parts were heated by the sun in different ways, so that they had to be equally cold, and that only at that moment could it be covered. And as far as I know, that's the first time that engineering is so precise that time becomes a factor in the making. So it's a very ambiguous and complex situation, because on the other hand, of course, we are also part of Chinese propaganda and accused in the West for kind of working with the wrong regimes. And it's kind of complex for us to weigh the value of whether the value of what we contribute weighs against the use that can be made of our participation. But I think architecturally is a kind of very significant part of, and which is really, as a private person, perhaps my greatest contribution to China, is that we built a building that has an unstable identity. From any direction you look, it looks completely different. Sometimes it looks impressive, other times it looks fragile, sometimes it looks solid, other moments it looks as if it's kind of tilting over. And I think to have introduced in a country so obsessed with stability an element which is unstable is in itself perhaps one of the kind of real virtues of what we did. Here, simply a symbol of the... So what did China learn us? China taught us to be precise in a way that we've never been before. And also it told us to act with a kind of speed that we had never acted before. What is unusual in Europe, the design of an architectural project can easily take 2.5 years. In Scandinavia, 3.5 years, the design only. In China, it is kind of accelerated more and more. And at some point, we were forced to build a model in 24 hours because the first model you saw was in plaster, and I needed to make a model that was transparent so that the Chinese leaders could actually understand that it was a building, not a sculpture, but a building that you could use. So simply learning that kind of speed was a very important thing for me. Again, it is the kind of thing of working in Asia, is a thing of it works only if you give, but also if you learn. I think in China we gave a freedom, introduced the freedom to experiment and to live with instability. In Taiwan and Taipei, we again maybe introduced a way of being experimental, but it was really based on a kind of Taiwanese example. Taipei is a very interesting city, very Chinese, very rough and very utilitarian. As if the whole kind of wave of luxury that affected the rest of the world in the last 15 years never happened. Therefore very sympathetic. It's the place in the world where people on average sleep the least, and that means that there is incredible nocturnal activity, night markets, night restaurants, and we had the kind of privilege that we were asked to do a competition on the place of a night market, and instead of kind of getting rid of the night market, we thought we could kind of place the theater straight on the night market so that our project would have an Asian base. So here you see the kind of the base kind of remains, and the project is on top of it. It was kind of 3 theaters, and kind of basically we felt that through this night market, the kind of Taiwanese public would be automatically invited into the building. It's 3 theaters, and typically the contemporary architect would make 3 separate theaters, but what we did was actually inspired on something we saw in the night market, a single pan in which 3 separate dishes were cooked. So when we applied that kind of to the theater, we kind of simply thought that maybe what you could do was to combine the technical sides of each of the theaters, so that you had a kind of huge stage tower, and that the theaters themselves, instead of operating separately, could also work together. So here you see each of these theaters can be an independent and traditional theater, but you can also connect them in this way, and then you get an exceptional possibility of staging a play over a theater with 100 meters stage, and therefore in this way, without kind of paying more, without being extravagant in itself, simply extending the possibilities that were given in the program. So there again I would say that it's kind of probably true that a European would have this idea, but on the other hand I would never have had it without the involvement of the night market. I know that this is not on your agenda, but it is part of Asia, the Arab world, and I want to kind of very briefly also talk about the Asian world, because I think the Arab world, because I think we understand it and misunderstand it flagrantly, and I really think to our peril. And this is a kind of picture of the leaders of the Emirate modernizing the country at the moment that they, for the first time, had the means to do so. We called it the oil crisis. For them, it was a kind of wonderful opportunity to think seriously about their countries. But modernization never happens without experts, and the leaders are dependent of consultants. And I would say that the Emirates and the Arab world has been a kind of a world of disastrous and really criminal consulting, where kind of some of the greatest absurdities that we now treat with enormous criticism are actually the suggestions that we made, or the kind of proposals that we sold them. And here you see a kind of desperate graph of the increasing income and the kind of wave of consultants. So if you so if you think that Dubai is crazy, then what you're actually saying that we are nauseatingly cynical in kind of producing that kind of craziness on their demand. So this is again, this is not Arab craziness; it's our craziness and our cynicism. But there is a different country, and that is a country where I have more than maybe any other country the feeling that I'm learning something, or I'm beginning to understand something which I think could also become eventually important in Europe. And that is Qatar. Qatar, you all kind of probably know it's a very rich country. It has enormous gas reserves. It has a very small personal original population and a huge amount of expats, and it is modernizing. It will have the World Cup. It's applying for the Olympics, and so in a way, no ambition is too radical. But I'm beginning to see a pattern. This is the Emir and his wife Sheikha Mauza, and these are their children. And kind of underneath the children, there is a kind of series of foundations. And I have a kind of feeling that I'm beginning to understand what is happening, because this whole family has divided in a way the responsibilities. The mother is responsible for education and is building education city, an incredible cluster of world-class universities with many American universities, think tanks, etc., etc. The son is kind of responsible for sports. And Eddie MEARC has been for the last 10 years kind of organized the Round of Doha, an incredible race through the desert. They have Al Jazeera, and as you know, Al Jazeera has been extremely instrumental in the so-called Arab Springs. And this is kind of really what you, a kind of network of Doha's kind of interest. And what I'm beginning to think, and this is, again, call it a political intuition, that kind of together with Turkey, Doha is positioning itself to be the leaders of the kind of Islamic world, and that what their kind of intention is that Turkey is no longer interested in being part of us, and who can blame them? I think that our hostility to Turkey is one of the most colossal mistakes that the Europeans have ever made, and that basically, from Morocco to Indonesia, this will become a kind of sooner or later a kind of modern territory with Turkey and Qatar as leaders. And what I think, where for me the issue of kind of learning comes in, is that where we are kind of thinking about sports, culture, politics, education, and media, I have a feeling that what they are doing is kind of simply treating it as a single block and as a single entity, no longer with separations, but where each aspect is actually pervading each other aspect. And I think that is a very modern kind of way of looking at the world, because somehow all our separate compartments kind of begin to feel actually kind of really really difficult and ancient. And if you, for instance, see how kind of single politician here can kill the cultural sector, it is perhaps an effect that there is no solidarity between and no relationships between these kind of parts, so that kind of in a way we have no answer against populism. And maybe this is a kind of sophisticated way of actually rethinking all those issues. Doha is the only country where there are huge sculptures that kind of tell people to learn, to think. not only, of course, in English, but also in Arabic. And it is maybe more than anything else a country that takes its children kind of seriously. And maybe that is for me the greatest difference between Asia now and Europe. We are scandalously negligent against our children. We let them kind of study in increasingly declining environments and declining schools, kind of problematic universities. This is kind of really unthinkable in Asia. This is, for instance, a film for Doha's children, where they are kind of made completely confident and enthusiastic about Doha's imminent future. And I cannot simply imagine a kind of European movie addressing 6 years old, telling that Europe will be great in 1925. But this is what is happening here, and that is perhaps also for me the greatest lesson, that simply, and it's kind of really sad to say, that Asia has become an area of optimism and we an area of pessimism. And therefore, if you see Doha and you see this, our own kind of organization, there's actually very little you have to add. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very, very much. And now the 200-something of us are going to have a very thorough discussion on the images in the west of the east. We have 6 minutes and 25 seconds to do that. Who wants to start a discussion? Yeah, that's the next thing. If no, there's a mic over there, then everybody can understand.
My name is Gary van Pinksteren. I worked as a journalist in China. And just as a point of curiosity, I don't know if you can tell us much about that, but this morning the ambassadors discussed probably also the new policy focusing on economics that has been proposed by the government. I wondered what your conclusions or ideas were. Are you happy to hear Mr. Koolhaas kind of say, well, this is not the road we should follow, or do you think that actually the government has a good point and you were all very happy on this road?
Oh, I think it's a very interesting question. To be honest, I don't think you can ask it to an ambassador, because he or she is supposed to say that whatever her or his minister says is the right thing. So let me speak for what I see. I'm a little bit independent in this respect. As far as I can see, as far as I can tell, I think most of the ambassadors, at least I've met, do think that the sort of thing we call economic diplomacy is rather, well, say narrow-minded. And that whatever we've done in the past, which was a much broader concept of diplomacy, may in fact be much more productive in the long run than the sort of short perspective we have right now. But if you put it like this to an ambassador out in the open, he will never give a signature.
Thank you very much.
Okay, there's a question here, or remark.
No, it's a very mundane question, and I put it only because it might be my only chance to ask it to Remco Koolhaas, talking about perceptions. Did somebody in China ever tell you that a lot of young ladies in Beijing regard your building as indecent? When I heard the story, and then at that time the building was not yet finished, the students and young academics from the universities, they blushed. They didn't even want to elaborate why it is indecent. decent, but they said in the young middle class of Beijing, there's a lot of objection because of this kind of association. And I missed the association.
Yeah, there has been a kind of serious scandal about that, the perception of the building, but I honestly, and I have been confronted with it very seriously. There's been even a kind of a huge wave of internet activism, and I can tell you it's really no joke to have an internet mobilization of China against a kind of particular building. But I have been, I believe that I've been able to explain that is a kind of totally nonsensical kind of reading of the project. And I think it came about, of Chinese insecurity, of having taken such a huge risk to make this selection, and whether my motives were really kind of sufficiently serious to justify that risk. I think that was ultimately, and I think that also part of the hostility was coming from old professors who felt it was simply obscene, not literally obscene, but obscene to ignore the traditional law of statics and to not be more straightforward. But I really believe that now, on the whole, it's a building assumed with a certain pride in Beijing, as far as I know. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. In the back.
It's actually one of the most interesting things about China, and also not that known, that there is an incredible, vivid criticism of anyone who operates there, yeah, whether foreign or not. And so therefore, your question, are you aware, must be a rhetorical question, because you cannot be in China and not be aware of it. And they have a kind of very efficient way of communication of all their intentions.
Okay, thank you. In the back. Yeah.
Yes, I'm Annemarie Montulet, and I've lived in Beijing for a while. And I've seen also the progress of the CCTV building, and I've heard you speak about it before. And what I remember is that you also had visions of when you enabled the building, designed the building, that you wanted to also change the CCTV internal organization, or you wanted to influence the internal organization, and maybe make it more transparent in the internal organization, or that the building would enable more communication between inside the CCTV. And I was wondering if there's any progress in that respect that you could comment on.
I never felt that I could promote those changes, but I only felt that such a building could support in general kind of modernization of the media. And I think that is almost entirely independent of the building and of the architecture, but there is simply now such a proliferation of channels, many of the channels actually intending to communicate with other worlds, the Western worlds, the Arab worlds, the African world, that kind of by definition there is the necessity to communicate not on Chinese terms, but on kind of combined terms. And I see that happening. And I think also that there is now a new channel, documentary channel. And I think that, again, in typically Chinese way, that the documentary is a kind of legitimate vehicle of modernization because it's objective, direct, and not political. And there you see a lot of new invention happening, even in CCTV.
Final remark or final question? Who dares? In front.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for a very interesting afternoon. My name is Patricia Spire. I'm professor of cultural anthropology of contemporary Indonesia here at Leiden. And I guess there was one of the things that was quite interesting in Peter's talk was this kind of critique of different perceptions of China and implicitly Asia as well, right? And Rem Koolhaas called for more attention to Europe and perhaps, articulating, understandably, a certain nostalgia for a Europe that perhaps once was, or a Netherlands that once was. I guess one thing that it seemed was implicit in the whole afternoon was also, and I think more explicit perhaps in Rem Koolhaas's talk, was what Europeans have learned from Asia and vice versa, and also the sense, I guess what I missed a bit was the sense of a hybrid Europe as well. I mean, it seemed to me one of the perceptions that was partly erected, again, was an Asia out there and a Europe here. So I'd like perhaps...
Okay, maybe Peter can answer that question. Okay, Peter? You must have the final words. I mean, that's...
Well, I think I have spoken quite a lot already on this day. So I'd actually rather pass the mic on to Em.
Well, this is a kind of a slightly weird format because, of course, it's 30 minutes. But that will be the last thing to say or to intend on my part. And actually, I was showing this kind of Ptolemaic landmass as kind of suggesting it is already a kind of single entity and a hybrid by definition. And if the lecture would have been longer, I would have started with Marco Polo and etc. etc. But there are two slides I couldn't kind of really show, and maybe they're still there. Let me see. No, it's yeah, which is. Yeah, this is kind of one of the shocking things. These are European students, and where they go and study. Still, the kind of vast majority to America, then a considerable part to Australia for reasons I sometimes find hard to understand, and then kind of a total fraction to China. And this is Chinese students and it turns out that there are as many Chinese students in Europe as in America. Enormous masses about which we don't think in terms of enrichment or advantage or collaboration. So the lecture will be longer.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Peter, thank you for being so modest. Thank Rem Koolhaas for a fascinating lecture. Thank you all for being here. But as you know, in this place, the last word is always by somebody from the university. So Douwe Breimer, former Rector Magnificus, will be the one who gives the concluding remarks.
Well, actually, I'll be very brief because of lack of time. There is a new inaugural lecture at 4 o'clock, so we have to fresh up the room for the next audience. But speaking for myself and probably also on behalf of all of you, we have learned a lot today. It has been an inspiring day, very informative. So thank you very much, actually, Peter, for providing this platform. That's what MEARC is basically all about, and that's how we should proceed. I have one word of consolation to Brinkhorst, Laurens Jan, namely that in the address of MEARC, it says not .nl, but it says .eu. So already the European dimension and ambition is there, which I think is extremely appropriate after what we have learned and heard today. So thank you very much for providing this platform. You should be proud of yourself for what you have achieved today, and we are definitely, as Leiden University, proud of you, of having you amongst our midst as a very prestigious professor of Chinese economy and development. So having said that, thank you all for participating, and I wish you all a very pleasant reception and afternoon. Thank you.